Join us as we delve into pressing sustainability and animal welfare issues with Dr. Fritha Langford, a senior lecturer at Newcastle University in the UK. With 25 years of expertise in farm animal welfare, Dr. Langford offers unique perspectives to our discussion. We explore topics including the challenges and opportunities of groundbreaking innovations like cellular agriculture, gene editing, artificial intelligence, and data analytics. These advancements hold immense promise in improving care, health, and welfare of farmed animals, fish, and pets, and addressing sustainability concerns, giving us hope for a better future. Drawing from Dr. Langford's research, we discuss practical and actionable steps that veterinary clinics can take to overcome barriers in providing postoperative care for cats based on real-world scenarios. We delve into the current state of fish welfare and explore strategies to enhance their well-being. Dr. Langford provides insights on how consumers can support ethical and sustainable practices in their food choices and pet care routines. We examine critical considerations for decision-making involving various species, from chickens and pigs to cats, cows, dogs, fish, shrimp, and more, all through the lens of sustainability and animal welfare. Dr. Langford also offers valuable advice for those interested in pursuing careers or studies related to animal welfare. Tune in as we uncover one of the most significant climate-related changes we can make to support sustainability, benefiting our planet, our health, and the health and welfare of animals worldwide. Hello, and thanks so much for joining. I am very excited that Dr. Fritha Langford, senior lecturer at Newcastle University in the UK, with a specialization and 25 years in farm animal welfare, is joining us today. Fritha, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Erin. So pleased to be here.
So your career has been dedicated to advancing research and understanding in a wide range of human and animal welfare issues, from dairy cows to cats. What do you believe are some of the most urgent challenges facing sustainability and animal welfare today, and how do they intersect?
Oh, it's a great question to start us off. Thank you, Erin. I do believe that sustainability and animal welfare are two parts of one of the biggest challenges that we're facing today, and that sometimes the sustainability or understanding sustainability issues, particularly to do with climate change, but also to do with biodiversity breakdown and other forms of pollution, are not necessarily taken as seriously as they should be by those in animal welfare. So I think it's really important to think about whatever animal we're talking about, whatever animal it is under our care, be it a farm animal, a companion animal, those animals in zoos, or animals in laboratories, we really need to think about how our changing climate is going to impact that relationship between them and us. And at present, I'm not seeing that move quite as quickly as I'd like it to move. There are both mitigation aspects, so thinking about the ways in which we change our relationships, particularly with farm animals, but also with other animals as well, to reduce the emissions that we're seeing in terms of climate change and other aspects of environmental degradation. But also, there are things that we, animal guardians, carers, keepers, farmers, laboratory users, need to think about in terms of adapting our processes in order to protect animal welfare. So I see the intersection being in two different ways, really, both thinking about the ways we can reduce our emissions from our animal relationships and how that might impact us in the future, but also how we protect animals from the worst excesses of what's going to happen during the changes that we're seeing from climate change.
So much to what you just said. I want to make sure that I'm unpacking that in terms
Mm,
of some of the key themes. So if I'm hearing you correctly, this connection between sustainability, climate, and animal welfare is not limited to one space. While we may often hear about these themes in particular contexts, especially when it comes to farmed animals,
Mhm.
that this intersection and these frameworks really apply across the board.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's remarkable, actually, how many emissions are created through some of the things that we do regularly with our animals. So, for example, medical treatments. Obviously, we want to give medical treatments to our animals, but of course, they come with quite a high single use plastic use. So, absolutely, it's not just about farm animals, it's in across the board in all different types of animals that we care for. That there's so many different things that we do with our animals, even when we're caring for them, that can create quite a lot of emissions from a climate change point of view. So, for example, the plastic use in veterinary medicine is enormous. Now, of course, I'm not advocating that we stop treating our animals, but thinking about perhaps unnecessary treatments or thinking about mitigating those emissions in some way would be really important. Other things are to do with, for example, breeding technologies. So, where we use breeding technologies in our companion animals or in our zoo animals. For example, a lot of zoo animals now we use artificial insemination or even things like embryo transfer to be able to ensure that we have high quality genetics in the animals that we keep within zoos. But in doing so, that comes with a much higher plastic count than it would do if we allowed ordinary breeding. So there are all sorts of small examples within all types of animal situations that we perhaps even don't think about that really can add up once you start investigating all of those different types of treatments.
Makes perfect sense. And for each of these examples, there's also the animal welfare questions, right?
Oh,
In terms
absolutely. Absolutely. And so all of them intersect with animal welfare because the animal's experience is most important here. So when I'm talking about animal welfare, I'm really considering the animal's experience as being first and foremost the most important thing. So what does that animal feel in the situation, in the housing, in the care that it's receiving? And that to me is fundamental for animal welfare. So both the physical and the mental side of what they're experiencing is really important.
absolutely. And just for our listeners' awareness, as we continue through this conversation, it sounds like you're encouraging us to think about the individual animal, even if we're talking about a group or a species as we go through these various
Yeah,
examples and questions. Uh,
absolutely. And sometimes that's very difficult when we're thinking about particularly farm animals, when we're considering, for example, a shed of meat chickens or broiler chickens, which might have upwards of 20 to 60,000 birds in one place. It's very difficult to consider the individual, but the individual is where animal welfare is at, the individual experiences. And so that's the important thing.
Thank you so much for that context. Absolutely. So I want to draw on a few different examples that you shared, and we can certainly come back to, we've talked about a number of different key areas of focus that we'll continue to come back to through the conversation. But to continue on with the themes that you were mentioning in terms of farming,
Mm,
as we look toward the future of farming, we see the emergence of alternative proteins and technologies like cellular agriculture
mm.
and gene editing as two emerging areas of innovation right now. How can these innovations be harnessed to improve animal welfare, sustainability, and more? And are there any risks to animal welfare with employing these technologies?
Yeah, it's a fascinating time in which we live, isn't it, Erin? There's
Absolutely.
so many new technologies out there, and sometimes it's quite hard to keep abreast of them all, really, and to understand where each of them are going because they offer different positives and potential risks. So you mentioned there about cellular agriculture, which is what we're describing there is harvesting cells from animals in order to grow them in an artificial environment to produce meat to be then eventually a food product for humans. It's a very interesting area. I think at the moment it's still extremely energy heavy. So it's not a particularly sustainable food at present. And of course, one of the biggest questions from an animal welfare point of view, is it going to improve animal welfare? It certainly doesn't improve the welfare of the animals that those cells are being harvested from. So we need to be considering those animals and how they are kept, how they are farmed, and whether they are having their cells harvested in life or post mortem. All of those questions are difficult to answer because some of these businesses are occurring in different countries across the world where perhaps some regulations aren't quite as tight as other places. So it's not always straightforward to find the answers to those questions. Whether or not cellular agriculture will take off is more of a human question, isn't it? A lot of people are slightly weirded out, for want of a better term, by the idea of eating meat that has not come from an animal, which is quite interesting when you think about the processes we have to go through in order to get meat from an actual animal. But I do think there's a lot of potential there to replace a lot of the meat that we perhaps don't think about so much. We know that in the UK, for example, the huge majority of people eat chicken, massive majority of people. So although the UK is one of the countries in Europe that has the highest proportion of vegetarian and vegans, we're still talking around about 90 to 93 or 4% of people eat chicken. So a huge number of people. And of those, around about 60% of people eat chicken at least 3 times a week. And they're not eating a whole chicken, most of those people. They aren't buying a whole carcass that has I suppose, the feeling of the bird, has the memory of the fact that this was once a living animal. Most people consume chicken either that's already cooked, within a cafe type situation or a fast food joint or whatever, or they're getting food that is already pre-prepared in some way. So they are not having to deal with the carcass itself. And I think almost takes away the feeling that this is from an animal. And to me, that seems the ideal place to start in terms of scaling up cellular agriculture, because if you're not thinking of that meat as coming from an animal anyway, perhaps swapping out for something that has been grown from a bunch of cells in a lab would be a really good opportunity. And we'll probably come to this as well later on, but in general terms, I think the animals that suffer most from a farming perspective, at least a land-based farming perspective, from poor welfare are chickens and pigs. And anything we can do to reduce our reliance on meat chickens is a great thing. I personally think bring it on. I would be very happy to see a scaling up and a rolling out of cellular chicken, if that's possible, with the caveats that it would be important to think about where those cells are coming from, of course. And if we can do it in a way that is a lot more efficient in terms of energy than it is at present. Gene editing, very interesting. There are enormous benefits to gene editing.
If it's okay, I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to make sure I'm summarizing a couple points that you raised
Yeah, go
here
for
in
it.
terms, just to make sure our listeners are capturing all the important insights that you just shared. So if I were to provide a simplified summary, and please correct me if I've missed or mischaracterized anything here. Essentially, when we're talking about cellular agriculture, we're talking about growing meat from cells.
Mm,
And so when we get back to our framework of thinking about the individual chicken's experience, if one were to ask, what is the animal welfare for cellular agriculture compared to what is animal welfare for chickens today?
mm.
As you mentioned, chickens are considered to have one of the poorest animal
Tourist,
welfare
yes.
experiences of any species. And that includes a variety of concerns that essentially, in large part, result from fast growth, right? So essentially, we have bred chickens over time to grow faster from
Mhm.
an industry perspective. And there are other considerations when it comes to the living conditions, as you mentioned, living in environments where They're living among many other birds. They may not have access to the outdoors, and they're growing very rapidly. So they
Mm.
experience pain. They have difficulty walking. There are a variety of different issues when it comes to the chicken's lived experience. And so remembering, number one, that even if the product that's out there on the market doesn't really resemble a chicken, that this is an animal, and that it is having its own lived experiences when we consider our own choices of whether to try cellular agriculture based products or not is an important part of that consideration process. And while today cellular agriculture is still very early, so we need to think about a variety of considerations, including the fact that it's not yet particularly sustainable in that it's still in the research and development phase and expensive from many perspectives compared to where the industry aims to be, that there is an important part, as you mentioned, in terms of where the cells come from. So whether those cells are coming from living birds or whether they're coming from birds that are no longer living. Am I summarizing those
Yeah,
points correctly?
that sounds perfect. I think it's really important to remember that we have bred chickens. In some ways, it's quite amazing. We have produced an animal that we can take from egg, hatching, to table in around 35 days. It's incredible. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing, but it is incredible that we have done that. And we've done that mostly through selection, artificial selection, but still selection as opposed to any form of genetic modification or anything like that. This is selecting for the quickest possible growth and the biggest possible feed efficiency. So those birds, they eat a lot and they don't do much else. What the problem is that they grow very fast and they still have a baby chick apparatus underneath. So they put on a lot of weight during that period of time, but their bones don't mature in the same way that they would do if they had grown in a much more slow way. And as you say as well, these animals are kept in conditions that are not conducive to particularly good animal welfare.
Thank you so much. I just want to make sure that we're helping to elevate all the important insights that were
No,
in your
absolutely.
first discussion before continuing. And I think that's a perfect segue to what you were starting to introduce in terms of gene editing.
Gene editing. So, very basically, what gene editing is modifying the genome of an animal or an organism. Wheat, for example, is another area which is being looked into, but we're going to be talking about animals today. Editing the genome of an animal, so the genetic code of an animal, but only mutating genes within its own genome. So not bringing in genetics from a different organism. So this is not the same as what we would classify as genetic modification, where we take, for example, genetics from a bacterium and put that into a chicken. So this, what we're doing here is we're getting the bird's or the mammal's own genome and making a very small edit, often to one part of the genome that perhaps confers susceptibility or resistance to a particular disease. So it is technically a mutation that could happen in nature. Okay, but it's done by us. So we make the choice to make that mutation, but it's a mutation that could have happened naturally. And of course, mutations happen all the time naturally. They're always going on whenever we have breeding and cell division. Many thousands of mutations can occur during the time, but usually they don't necessarily happen in the bits that we want them to. So it's basically targeted mutations. So that's what gene editing is. And what we're doing with our farmed animals in particular, but also in other animals, which we'll maybe come to in a minute, is considering where we can make these targeted mutations to improve their welfare, improve their sustainability, perhaps improving their efficiency, improving their health, and also improving productivity if it's farmed animals. So, two big examples, both of which come from some colleagues at the University of Edinburgh, are looking at specific diseases that pigs and poultry are particularly susceptible to. So if we take the pig example first, there is a viral disease that's seen throughout the pig industry across the world. It's porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome, and we call it PRRS for short. And PRRS is it's a disease that has a very big economic consequence. It causes reproductive failure in older pigs and respiratory disease in younger pigs, and it has quite a high mortality rate. So it has obvious welfare impacts for those animals. So in order to prevent PRRS, or not prevent it, but minimize it, you have to have really good biosecurity, good hygiene, and minimize stress in those animals. But what if you could change the gene that is related to the susceptibility? And we can. So we can actually create pigs that are resistant to PRRS. So if we look at it from that point of view, we can see that there's an instant welfare benefit. These animals are no longer going to be suffering from this disease in a farming situation or a pet situation if they're kept as pets or whatever it might be. So you can see there's a welfare benefit. But what could be the welfare risk? One problem of making an animal resistant to a disease through this gene editing process might be that then we have to pay less regard to minimizing stress, keeping conditions hygienic, and providing good biosecurity. Because in a way, we no longer have to try and prevent that disease. The animal is not going to suffer from it anyway. And so I think this is quite a big ethical problem for these breeding technologies, is that it's possible to keep an animal in worse conditions if it's not going to be susceptible to the disease. There are also other welfare risks further downstream, because of course we don't know what unintended consequences there might be from this mutation. It's said that it could be a mutation that could happen in nature, but that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be unintended consequences anyway if it was a natural mutation versus a gene edit. But what we don't know is whether or not that gene has other important benefits for the animal. So whether the gene in its susceptibility to PRRS state actually confers benefits to the animal. And so by turning that off to make the animal resistant to PRRS, perhaps we are reducing those benefits that that gene naturally produces. So that's two quite complex issues that could be risky for animals with that particular edit. Additionally,
Well,
the chicken one, do you want me to talk
I
about the
do.
chicken one?
I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly and that our
Go for
listeners
it.
are hearing some of the key takeaways that, at least from my interpretation, you're illuminating, which is number one, if we are optimizing to address a particular issue like PRRS, we may be simultaneously supporting industry need, right? Supporting human health or being needs from a meat consumption perspective while improving an aspect of, in this case, pigs, in broader
Mhm.
cases, animal welfare experiences. However, if we are focusing specifically on the industry goals, we can lose sight of other aspects of the animal welfare comprehensively. Meaning, if we're focused on saying, okay, we've solved this PRRS issue, so we don't have to worry about these environmental concerns. We don't have to worry about these sanitation concerns. We don't have to worry about X, Y, or Z. What are we then doing to the animal's experience? And are we compromising animal welfare through this innovation in some respects? And the second piece being that we don't know what we don't know, right? So if we change something, particularly again with human aims in mind, what are the implications for the animal is what I'm hearing as question number one. There may also be implications when it comes to some of the industry or human health and well-being benefits, but in particular, if we're editing the gene of an animal, what does that do to the animal? We don't necessarily know, even if this could occur in nature, because this is a human-driven process. Am I hearing you right in terms of those two themes?
Absolutely. So I think in terms of the second risk, it's important to realize that yeah, exactly. We don't know what the downstream impacts might be. And because we've only looked at a few generations, we might not have come up with all of the environmental threats that perhaps that gene is protecting against. And so we may inadvertently reduce an animal's ability to cope with some other aspect of its environment, not just PERS.
Thank you for clarifying.
There's all sorts of ways we could think about gene editing, and another one would be for another major disease that we see both in farmed animals and in wild birds, and that is avian influenza. A viral infection which has huge mortality within both poultry industry, but also, as I say, for wild birds. And we're seeing that, I think, in the news just recently that avian influenza has now reached Antarctica into the penguin population, which is very sad. One of the problems with avian influenza is each new strain does seem to be coming out of the poultry industry. And of course, even though the poultry industry generally has quite high biosecurity, you have an awful lot of birds who are also all relatively closely related to one another, and that is a very good breeding ground for disease. One of the possibilities with gene editing is to breed our laying hens and potentially our meat chickens to not be susceptible to avian influenza, and that to be relatively broad spectrum, which would then reduce the likelihood of those animals from suffering from the disease, but it also reduces the likelihood of that disease mutating into a new strain. So there are some great benefits. But of course, that means that perhaps we focus less then on other potential treatments or other potential preventions of avian influenza, from improving the conditions for chickens so that they experience better welfare when they're farmed, or from thinking about vaccinations, for example. And in doing so, we actually leave our wild birds potentially more at risk in the meantime, because we're not actually then focusing on other ways of combating this disease.
Absolutely. And I think one key takeaway is for anyone listening who may think I'm not particularly focused on chickens, but I care deeply about wildlife, whether we're thinking about penguins, other birds locally or in other geographies. We are seeing that when it comes to these strains, no matter what new strain it is, as you mentioned, and that continue to evolve and change over time, that they are resulting, at least in the vast majority of cases, right? We know that they're resulting from the poultry industry, and that what may seem like a solution from one lens will likely not create an all encompassing solution for all of the birds that are affected by this already. Am I hearing that right?
Absolutely. And there are other impacts as well. So, for example, Um, there are many poultry breeds, but the huge majority of the poultry industry are using only one or two of the breeds, be it for meat chickens or for laying hens. Not all of the myriad of breeds that have arisen throughout time in all of the countries where humans are in the world. And what we do then is we leave those other breeds that are perhaps really suited to the environment in which they have been bred into to potentially suffer big consequences, high mortality consequences from avian influenza. And we may lose the genetics that are held within those backyard flocks of interesting breeds from around the world. And that can be problematic too for our future. So when we consider, for example, say in 20 years' time, when we look at climate models and the projections of where our climate is going to be then, we are likely to need birds if we are still farming chickens at that point. We are likely to need birds that have a good resilience to heat and humidity, which our modern high-yielding breeds don't really have. But some of our breeds, for example, that you see in the backyards of all sorts of tropical countries. I was recently in the Philippines, and different breeds in the Philippines of fantastically resilient birds. They're very resilient to, funnily enough, tropical conditions. And those genetics could be at risk if we just blanket gene edit our laying hens and meat chickens in the poultry industry and leave the others to their fate.
There are many complicating factors when we think
Oh
about
my
the
goodness.
benefits and the
It's very,
trade-offs.
very complex,
Yeah.
and everything is interlinked. And I think when you say it, absolutely, some people who are listening to this may have no interest in chickens. I mean, honestly, they should have an interest in chickens. Chickens are wonderful. But people might not have an interest in chickens, but they may well care for wildlife. But they need to realize that our farmed livestock are everywhere. And so anything that impacts them can have a devastating effect on our wildlife.
And so when we talk about the choices that we make as consumers, and we'll talk about this later on in more detail, the choices we make every day for our own meals, for the meals of our family, for what we choose to eat matter. And we'll talk
Absolutely.
about how those matter for the species in direct question, right? Whether we're talking about chickens, pigs, cows, and more, cattle and more, but they also matter for wildlife. So for those listening who are really interested in this conversation from a sustainability perspective, the food choices we make very much matter for the sustainability of wildlife and other implications, which we'll talk about in more detail. But really appreciate you highlighting those connection points. I think we can often summarize these statements in very high level ways, right? It may be a simple message that our food choices matter and what that means in practical terms for particular species, for particular wildlife populations. I think is a very helpful part of this discussion that you're really illuminating in concrete ways. Thank you
And I
so much for
promise
using
I won't always just answer every question about chickens.
it.
However,
I can
chickens are
deeply too. Yes.
they're so important because they are the most common land-based farmed animal that we have, and it's many billions every year. And yeah, I think without occasionally considering the chicken, we're leaving out quite a big chunk of how animals and sustainability interact.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, I had the great privilege of learning from Dr. Fritha Langford as part of the International Animal Welfare Ethics and Law program at the University of Edinburgh. And one of the questions that we unpacked was when we think about the lived experience of chickens, do they have lives worth living? And I can certainly include some links to some helpful resources on that topic. But this is an ongoing question, right, in the animal welfare community and an urgent one when we think about chickens as well as other species. So, really appreciate you raising the importance of that. And I hope that our listeners have a greater appreciation for chickens coming out of this conversation as well. But when we think about technology and innovation, we've talked a little bit about alternative proteins, cellular agriculture, and gene editing. What do you see as opportunities to leverage AI, data analytics, gene editing, and other technology advancements to enhance the care, health, and welfare of livestock while addressing sustainability concerns? And would also love to extend this question to companion animal care as well.
Mhm.
And when we're thinking about these things, what are the opportunities and what other obstacles do you foresee in these realms too?
Mm. Again, a fascinating question, and one that I think we'll probably be able to answer better in 5 years' time compared to what we can do just now. We're just at the tip, aren't we, of understanding the possibilities of AI. In this case, we're talking artificial intelligence. We've just been answering questions about avian influenza, also AI, and occasionally I get mixed up because of artificial insemination, also AI. But let's focus on artificial intelligence.
Good reminder
And
not to use abbreviations. Yes,
yeah,
thank you.
it's very confusing, particularly for us in animal science. Yes, I think there are huge potential benefits, and we will, as I say, we will learn so much more in the coming years. But when I'm thinking about artificial intelligence, I'm considering mostly machine learning at the moment. So that aspect of artificial intelligence. And one of the ways in which that can be really helpful for animal welfare is being able to sort through data, being able to understand differences in patterns far quicker than humans can, especially when we're looking at large numbers of animals. So I'll start with a farm animal example, and then we'll maybe go into some companion animal examples as well. So, for dairy cattle, for example, dairy cattle are commonly farmed across the world, and they have different welfare challenges depending on where they're being farmed. But if we take UK and US examples just now to help our listeners consider this, one of the biggest health-related welfare challenge that dairy cattle face is to do with lameness. Now, lameness, where an animal is showing a difference in gait, so they're walking unevenly, they're not putting the same amount of weight on each hoof, is down to the feeling of pain. The reason that the animal is limping is because she's in pain. So it's a big problem. And what we know in terms of evidence is that if you look across UK farms, that on average, a farm will have roughly 20 to 25% of its cows will have some degree of lameness at any one time. And we see similar numbers, slightly higher numbers in the US and across Europe as well. There are different challenges in different parts of the world, but let's focus on the UK and US. This is a big problem area, and it's quite an intractable problem, by which I mean those numbers have not really changed in the past 20 years. So if we go back to 20 years ago, in fact, I was going out round farms in 2005 so 19 years ago, to assess cows on different farms in the UK. And what we found was that the farms we were looking at, we would see 20 to 25% of cows with some degree of lameness. So it's exactly the same numbers. Conversely, in another health-related problem that dairy cows suffer from, which is mastitis, the painful inflammation of the udder, we have seen extremely good work from farmers in terms of treating that disease and getting on top of it very quickly. So although mastitis is still a common disease within dairy farming, we see fewer cows suffering from mastitis over a longer period of time because of the way we treat that disease. We use antibiotics where they're needed, painkillers are often used, and so we know that cows are not suffering from mastitis pain for too long a period of time when they get the disease in the first place. There are some cows, of course, that end up having problems with that disease, but in the main, cows are being treated very well for mastitis. The reason for this is there are very high penalties if disease-causing organisms go into the milk tank, so the big tank where all the milk from the dairy cows go. And also there are very high penalties if any drug residue, so antibiotic, antimicrobial residue gets into the milk. And this means that farmers want to treat it as quickly as possible because there's a huge loss in milk and therefore loss in money if either disease-causing organisms or drug residues get into milk.
Those penalties are
Yes, that's
imposed
right.
by laws and regulations.
Correct, but also from the milk sellers, so the cooperatives or producer-related organisations that sell milk. So yes, there are big penalties there. For lameness, there isn't the same incentive. So although a cow will end up having a reduced milk yield overall when she's been lame for a period of time, y- the treatment isn't going to impact the milk tank, the large quantity of milk that the farmer will gather from all of his or her cows. And the disease-causing organisms that live on the hoof, if it's an infectious cause, don't get into the milk. And so there isn't the same incentive to treat, even though most farmers, we know again from evidence that most farmers agree that lameness is a painful condition.
So, in summary, the farmers know that lameness causes pain for the animals, but
Yes,
because that pain and the possibility of infection are really only affecting the animals, they're not affecting human consumption of milk. We don't see anywhere near the level of penalties or addressing of these issues in the way that you were describing they've been addressed with mastitis, because those have direct implications for the safety and the consumption of the milk by humans. Is that a fair
correct.
summary?
Correct. There are other complications as well that make it more intractable. There are roughly 60 different causes of lameness that interact with one another. So I'm not saying that the dairy farmers only think about that milk going down the drain, because there are these other issues as well. But it is one of the big differences between mastitis and lameness, and you can see that they are treated differently on farm by most farmers. Okay, so we have this issue where many of our cows are lame. Not many of them are really severely lame. That might be a much smaller percentage on farm. But those animals that are feeling their feet are not walking in a normal way, we would say are mildly lame, but that still indicates that they are suffering some degree of pain and discomfort from their feet. But they are quite difficult to pick out. So people can do it. So you can become trained as a lameness scorer and go and score cows when they're coming out of the parlour or they're walking in a straight line away from you. It's very time consuming. It's quite tricky to do, as I say, in terms of keeping reliable with yourself. It's also quite difficult to maintain what we call inter-observer reliability. So if you have two people, they might not see the exact same level of lameness in a large number of cattle. And it takes a long time to train people as well. Roughly about 15 hours of training to become self-reliable in terms of your lameness scoring. And you need to do that on a regular basis in order to keep being reliable over time. So you can see that there are possibilities in terms of human scoring, but that it's quite tricky to do, quite expensive to do. What if we could train a computer to do it? What if actually a computer might be better at recognizing very subtle behavioral traits that cows are showing when they have this lower level of lameness? And what if actually a computer could pick it out far earlier than a human once they are trained on a big enough data set? And that's one of the really exciting areas of using artificial intelligence, machine learning really, to understand large numbers of animals and be able to help in quick treatments and stop these chronic problems being around for so long, but also being such a big problem on farms. So yes, so that's one example from dairy cows. I have other examples from other different farming sectors as well. But I think we've talked quite a lot about farming, so perhaps we should go on to companion animals. So again, there's potential for machine learning in improving detection of problems for companion animals as well. This area is perhaps less mature. We're seeing quite a lot of products, I think, coming to market now with regards to farm animal welfare and using what I've just described for lameness in cattle, whereas we're not seeing that quite so quickly for our companion animals. But it may well be likely that we can use the similar techniques to recognize certain behaviors or skin conditions or other types of um, early warning signs of health problems in our cats and dogs. One difficulty, particularly with dogs, is that they're so morphologically distinct from one another, as in there's so many different breeds and they look very different to one another. And that can be quite tricky for computers to understand. So we have to get over that problem, particularly if we need the facial features of a dog to be able to train the computer to make the right choices. So that's quite interesting in considering how well we know dogs and how well we think we understand their behavior. Being able to get an appropriate data set to train the computers to recognize different facial expressions, for example, has proven to be quite difficult. But I don't think it's insurmountable. It's just requiring enough of all the different types of dogs to be able to do it. But yeah, so there's plenty of possibilities for using artificial intelligence, machine learning in particular, for improving animal health.
Absolutely. So if I'm hearing you right, essentially we could think about the opportunities for machine learning applying to our pets, and we need to recognize that we just picked two breeds, right? A Great Dane and a Chihuahua are going to have tremendous differences. So there is that additional work that needs to go into training the models, right? And inputting all of those different breeds and features. And so it is early stage. However, there is plenty of opportunity for machine learning to advance veterinary medicine, the health of pets, and help presumably to inform the way we care for our animals at home as well. However, that likely depends on engaging with our veterinary teams and that interaction with the health side of our animal care.
Absolutely. But yeah, there's all sorts of ways we could think that artificial intelligence could be beneficial for particularly picking up on early warning signs of disease, but also what we might consider as behavioral problems of our companion animals, or perhaps unwanted behaviors within the home. Maybe I would prefer to call them.
Understandable.
But there are some risks. So the again, whenever we consider these technologies, we need to think, what are they replacing and is that problematic? So if we take one of these technologies that we might use within our farmed animals to help us sift through large quantities of animals to pick out problems, maybe that means that the human need to be involved less with those animals. Perhaps that once again reduces our human animal bond with our farmed animals. One that used to be quite important when we had only small numbers of animals on farm, but now is becoming less and less important as we have more and more animals per human in a farmed environment. And perhaps that just brings us one step further away from understanding our animals. And I think the human recognition of things when they go wrong, or being able to put two and two together in ways that computers can't do, creative thinking, is not possible at the moment from machines. And so they will just do what the algorithm says as opposed to making critical decisions at critical times. So I think it's important to ensure that there is human watch on the process as well.
Absolutely. And just to draw on the pet example from a lens that I think many of us can think about in our day to day experience. So many of us start with the love of our pets, right, as our entry point into animal welfare and then thinking about the lived experience of other animals. And we're caring for those animals every day. If we think about the possibility to leverage more data, to leverage AI or machine learning when we think about enhancing our own care of our animals, we can think about these same themes for ourselves. We have the bond that we have with our pets because we're engaged with them, because we are observing and interacting with them on a day to day basis. If we start to focus more on the data and getting whatever interface we're reviewing, we're focusing on outsourcing that to relying on the data and not our own observations. If we're thinking, I'll get an alert when there's a problem, so I don't need to be paying attention to these various aspects of my animal's care, That's another way to think about what I'm hearing you describing, which is that we can remove ourselves so far from the equation that we're losing that bond with the animal. We're losing other insights that really do require human awareness and observation. So we want to think about the benefits, and we also need to be mindful of over reliance, of removing ourselves from engaging with animals and the costs that go with that, whether we're thinking about our companion animals and our love of our pets, whether we're thinking about the industry implications or both.
Absolutely right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for walking through that. When we think about your research, I was particularly interested in one of your recent studies, which was certainly done in collaboration with others, and we'll include the link for our listeners. And this study shed light on the challenges facing veterinary clinics in providing postoperative care for cats. I'd love to hear your thoughts and what insights can we glean from your findings, and what actionable steps can veterinary clinics take to overcome barriers and improve cat welfare.
Yes, this was a lovely study to be involved with. It came from a PhD student that I supervise along with colleagues at the University of Edinburgh. The PhD student now graduated with the PhD, of course. Samira Zaini is going to be a tremendous advocate for animals in Malaysia. She lives in Malaysia and she's just wonderful in every way. And so I'd be very happy for people to look at her work and, yeah, see what a tremendous job she did. Yeah, she was really interested in understanding what veterinarians in Malaysia knew about animal pain and what they were doing about it. She came to us to do her PhD, and off she started with a big old survey to try and ascertain what veterinarians understood about animal pain, knew about pain recognition, and what they were using in terms of the pain relief in operations. So that's where she came from, and that's what she started doing. However, when she was going to different veterinary practices in Malaysia, what she noticed was that, unlike what she'd been taught in Malaysia in the veterinary hospital at the main university there, UPM, the vets in practice were not necessarily providing all of their cats that have been undergoing some form of veterinary treatment good cat care post surgery. So what she would see, I suppose I describe it more simply by what she was seeing were cats in bear cages, cats in cages piled on top of one another, cats not given bedding or toileting facilities or any place to hide. And what we know about cats, of course, is that they are quite fearful animals in stressful situations. They want to be able to hide themselves away. And of course, if they've undergone surgery, there's a high likelihood that they'll be feeling some amount of pain. And what Shamira came to realize was that there was a problem here, that the vets who'd answered her survey were really keen on understanding more about pain recognition. But because they were keeping the cats post-operatively in really quite poor conditions, it would be quite difficult for them to be able to recognize pain. As I'm sure your listeners are aware, some elements of pain and stress are quite highly related. If an animal or a human for that matter is particularly stressed, it's much more difficult to understand whether they're in pain or not. Once you've got an animal in a more relaxed state, then it's much easier to ascertain whether or not that animal is in pain and could do with some more pain relief.
So essentially, you're saying if an animal is stressed, doesn't have its needs being met, it's very difficult to unpack what are we seeing with these
Mhm.
behaviors with what we can observe from cats, since cats can't tell us how they're feeling. And is
Correct.
this stress from the environment? Is this stress from, as you mentioned, not having a place to hide? Is this actually pain? What is the animal's experience post-operatively becomes much more difficult to navigate.
Absolutely. And so that then gives us difficulty for protecting animal welfare in a post-operative environment It stops people accurately within the veterinary practice accurately being able to work out when that animal may need a top-up of pain relief. So they were providing pain relief. It wasn't that they were carrying out the operation wrong or anything like that. That's not what we were seeing. What we were seeing is just the lack of good environmental facilities for those animals to recover from. And what we also saw was that wasn't equally applied across cats. So we would see that cats that had been given perhaps more routine operations, like a ovohysterectomy, what we might call a spay or a neuter for female cats, were not likely to be given bedding or a hiding place or toileting facilities. Whereas perhaps if a cat had come in with a severe trauma, like a car accident, then those animals would be provided with greater facilities within the cage. And that let us think that's very interesting, because that's quite an interesting element of what those humans are thinking, right? They're not considering the animal's experience first and foremost, because the animal's experience, the cat doesn't know that the ovohysterectomy is a routine procedure and the vets do it every day and it's their bread and butter type of operation. The cats don't know that. For the cats, it's a novel environment, scary new humans, and something painful has happened to them. And then they've been put in an environment with a whole load of other cats, lots of new and scary smells, and that wasn't being thought through. Whereas the vets obviously had a huge amount of empathy for these animals that had suffered trauma. So what we started to think of was that this is quite an interesting example of what we call detached empathy. And we see this in human hospital treatments, where when something becomes routine for the medic, they stop thinking it as not routine for the patient. And yeah, so that's quite interesting. And it's the first time we've really seen this in veterinary world, and we'd like to explore that further. But Shamira, the most important thing for her was that there was going to be some practical changes here. So what she wanted to know was, why are they not putting in the bedding and the hiding places and all of those things when she knows for a fact that most of those vets have been through the same type of schooling that she had and will have been taught that they ought to. She carried out a series of interviews with vets, so getting very rich data set from individuals about what they did, why they did it, what the barriers were to them providing good cat care. And there were multiple barriers. So there was this lack of understanding between the relationship between the stress caused by the environment and being able to recognize pain. So that was one of the issues, that people didn't necessarily know how connected those two things were. But also, of course, the socioeconomic environment that those veterinarians were practicing in was often one that was very different from the veterinary hospital. So it was one perhaps where clients didn't have very much money. The veterinarian perhaps didn't have very much money to have good facilities. They often said, I can't afford a washing machine on premises, and therefore I wouldn't necessarily be able to wash bedding. And I can't afford to have another member of staff whose job it would be to look after the animals post-operatively. And one thing we also see with a lot of veterinary medicine practiced around the world is that the professional position of veterinary nurse or veterinary technician that we might see in the US, veterinary nurse we tend to see in the UK, isn't really a profession that actually exists in most countries in the world. And that professional person whose professional interest is the care of the animal, and less about perhaps the surgery and the diagnostics, they don't exist. Or they don't exist in a professional capacity. They don't necessarily have that training. And so that was another barrier that we saw in Malaysia to providing good cat care. And we see it in many different countries as well. So not to single out Malaysia, it's just that was the country we were working in, as Shamira comes from Malaysia. But yeah, so it was a really fascinating study. Then what she wanted to do was go think, how do we do something about this? So after her series of interviews and the analysis of all of that data, she then developed using the human behavior change wheel and the COM-B model. She developed an educational, mostly educational intervention that also had an action planning element to help veterinarians understand the relationship between stress and pain recognition, but also what cheap, easy, and hygienic types of bedding they could use instead of having to get expensive items or the things that needed washing all the time. And so, yeah, so that's the intervention she carried out. Unfortunately, because it's a PhD, there's not always the opportunity to do that on many hundreds of people. She didn't have the funding to be able to do that over I think there's about 3,500 small animal vets in Malaysia. It would have been wonderful to capture all of those. But she did a good pilot study, I think, of around 30 people. And we did see some positive changes within those people. It's difficult to draw significant conclusions from that particular data set, but it certainly points in the direction for the future types of interventions we can do to improve animal welfare in veterinary practices post operations.
Thank you so much for walking through that. Certainly understand that this is a PhD study and much to think about in terms of building on this and exploring these questions in other geographies and with more veterinarians. If you were to think about even one or two actionable tips or strategies for those listening in veterinary clinics, and certainly in clinics where cost is likely a consideration, right? And inability to hire and or ramp up new training may be challenging at the moment. Are there any insights or tips from this study that you would share?
Yeah, absolutely. Simple things can work quite well. A bear cage is very uncomfortable for an animal that has just had an operation. And we chose ovuohysterectomy obviously because of the fact it's routine, but also because it's an internal operation and has many opportunities for causing pain. So a bear cage is not an ideal place for a cat to be recovering from any form of operation. But in the absolute I suppose in conditions where the vet is operating in quite a poor area, a cardboard on the bottom of the cage can be at least protecting the animal from the cage bottom. A better possibility is asking the client to bring a towel or an old jumper, a sweater or whatever to bring along with them that they have washed and that they're happy for the cat to be on, knowing that it's probably not going to be necessarily in a good state when they get it back. But yes, if they can bring something that they then can wash, that is a fantastic, very easy tip and can help clients explain some aspects of animal welfare to their clients. So veterinarians are able then to talk about the fact that the cat will need to hide away a bit and requires some comfort. And so that can be quite a good learning opportunity for clients as well. Yeah, and another thing is to prioritize um, action planning within your veterinary practice. So with the staff that you have, really think about how you might try and plan the day so that uh, people are always aware that they need to check every animal and that every animal deserves good comfort when they're recovering. And I suppose one of the things to do with cages being piled up on top of one another, again, thinking about barriers between those individual animals, again, that could be just as simple as cardboard. It's not necessarily the best product. Obviously, it's not going to be cleanable, but you can at least recycle it at the end of the day. And that means that there are less sustainability problems with that as well. I think really simple tips are really quite important here. Of course, there's all sorts of things you can buy if you have a little bit more money to enable you to buy, for example, little hiding boxes that can also go in the washing machine. If you do have laundry facilities, then those sorts of things are fantastic. But really considering, I think, the post-operative ward from the cat's point of view, that's important. One of the things that was interesting about Malaysia is that they have a lot more pet cats than pet dogs. There wasn't so much of a problem of cats being warded with dogs. But we do sometimes see that in other countries where pet dogs are much more common. And so considering separating out cats and dogs is quite important from the word go. So being able to have separate waiting areas for cats and dogs is quite important for the welfare of the cats.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I love how these tips regarding cardboard come back to our kickoff takeaway, which is that sustainability and animal welfare are integrally linked no matter which space we're talking about.
Absolutely.
And that important reminder for planning and for ensuring that every animal is considered as an individual. I think these are the kinds of things where, even from a strategic planning or a business operations or operational planning perspective, we can develop a plan, right? And it's easy for that plan to get finalized and approved and then end up on a shelf. And we want to
Mhm,
make sure that we are really building this in, to your point about the combi and behavior change model, in ways that are informing and enhancing and helping our teams adapt their behaviors and retaining those over time,
mhm.
and ensuring that we're looking at each animal individually in each and every case. I really
You're
appreciate
quite
this.
right. There's no use doing it today if you're not doing it tomorrow. And one thing we know in terms of habit, an important part of human behavior, is if you develop a new habit, what you do today informs tomorrow. So if you can try and develop new habits regarding the way in which you keep your animals in a post-operative environment, then that would be fantastic. Simple things usually work quite well.
Fantastic set of tips. Thank you. When it comes to these spaces and more, just wanted to see, are there any poignant anecdotes or stories or discoveries from your research that have really deeply resonated with you and helped to underscore how you see the importance of animal welfare on a personal level?
Yes, that's an interesting question. It's an interesting question because unfortunately, quite a lot of my anecdotes are those that are quite sad. It's funny, or not necessarily funny, but animal welfare scientists sometimes get given the moniker of bunny huggers. I'm sure you've heard of this term. And not that I'm saying that bunnies shouldn't be looked after, absolutely not, although they might not want to be hugged. It's important to think. But what we're generally working with is much more down the scale of animal suffering and animal misery. And therefore, we as animal welfare scientists and other people within the animal welfare community have to develop quite sort of an inner strength to be able to deal with that. And so now I'm trying to think of a happy story rather than just a sad one. I'm going to start with a sad one and then I'm going to bring it to a happy one. They're both going to be cow based, so I hope you'll forgive me for
I
focusing
love,
on farmed animals.
I love that.
When I was working on a project where we were trying to understand whether there were farm animal welfare differences on organic dairy farms versus conventionally farmed dairy farms, we went to a variety of farms and some were excellent, where those animals' welfare was as good as it possibly could be on a dairy farm at the time. And then there was a lot in the middle that were fairly mediocre. And there was one farm where I came away from it thinking, I'm not sure I can do this job anymore, which was quite shocking for me because I was quite used to seeing poor practice and some animals that were suffering. And I thought I'd built up a shell, but this farm had had many difficulties. And I think the worst thing about it wasn't that the animals were suffering, but was that the human involved absolutely loved his animals, but couldn't see beyond that love, that those animals had reached a point where they couldn't carry on. And it had occurred because of financial difficulty and personal stress and personal circumstances. But he had some animals that really shouldn't have been on that farm anymore. And I could not understand why they were still there. He said, "But I love those cows. These cows have been with me for years. This one, she's had grand calves going down the generations, and she's such a wonderful animal." I was thinking, but she can't walk and she's got an enormous wound on her udder and all these things that are very unpleasant. And that was quite an eye opener for me how complex human the human animal bond is and how human emotional responses to animals can sometimes make us not do the right thing. And that can be quite tricky to overcome, I think. So that was the one where I remember I happened to be staying with my mother at the time because it was quite nearby to where she lived. And I went back to my mum in the evening and said, I don't know if I can do this job anymore. So that's not great. And I'm glad to say that farm has changed a little in as much as there was a new farm manager who was working with the old farm manager. And so hopefully things have turned around there. However, the happier story is also considering dairy cows. And one of the big issues, which I know a lot of people are very interested in, which is the cow-calf separation. So when we take away the calf from the cow. Now, of course, in dairy farming, in modern dairy farming, we're wanting to get as much milk as possible from the cows in order to be able to sell that milk, especially as milk is very cheap. It's a very cheap product, and therefore farmers do not often make a lot of money from the milk, so they need as much milk as they can per cow. And in order to do that, we take the calf away from its mother and we raise that calf separately, either on milk that we've taken away from the cows for some reason, perhaps there's antibiotics in the milk, for example, or more commonly these days on milk replacer, so similar to formula milk that we might give human babies. And we do that as soon as possible. And there are good welfare reasons for doing that as soon as possible. If you're going to take a calf away from its mother, then doing it as soon as possible is best for both, in as much as it's less stressful for both mother and calf because of the bond is not formed instantly. And so you have less stress for both of those animals if you take them as soon as possible. And of course, you have to ensure that the calf receives as much colostrum as possible within that early period of time to get antibodies to different diseases on the farm. So there are good welfare reasons for doing that. But I've been thinking for years, and I'm sure many other people have as well, that perhaps this is just unfair on these animals. We're taking the young animal away from its mother, and we know that in other cattle systems, like beef suckler systems, that calves do extremely well when they're with their mums, because they are not only getting milk at the right number of times a day, they're also getting that social interaction and the support that they would get naturally from their mother. And dairy calves don't have access to them. Interestingly, there has been an increase in numbers of farms. We have some, I actually live in Scotland, and we have some in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, and increasingly so in other areas of Europe. And there's even interest in the US as well, you'll be glad to hear, from farms where they want to do something different, where they still want to farm for dairy products, but they don't want to take the baby calf and the mother away from each other so soon after birth. In fact, they would prefer to leave them for a period of time, preferably almost to when that calf would naturally wean. And so what we've seen is farms really trying to work out how to do that, still within a modern dairy system, to be able to keep calves with cows. There's lots of challenges. But I have seen some fantastic examples where this is happening now. And not only are they able to keep the calf with the cow, they are able to get a good yield from that cow. So they're able to get milk that's then going into the system to be able to sell it. That product, of course, has a niche value. And so they're able to sell it for more money. And in fact, they're able then to do really well as a farm. As I say, there's lots and lots of challenges, and no farmer would tell you that it's dead easy. It isn't dead easy. You really have to think about it. And I would consider that if any farmer was out there listening to this and thinking this is the way I would like to go forward. Get in touch with some of these farms that are already quite mature in this system because they will help you. They're trying to help all sorts of people set up with these systems.
Thank you
I
so
think
much.
it has a real potential for having an avenue for positive dairying, and I think that's wonderful.
I want to make sure I'm unpacking several important things that you just said. In just one quick point to your last takeaway there, in terms of getting in touch with these farms, would you suggest we include some links, or is there a particular search phrase that you might recommend for those listening that want to learn more and get in touch with farms that have put these into practice?
Absolutely, we can include some links anyway, but generally, if you put in cow-calf systems or family coup, for those who speak Dutch perhaps, that's KOO, then that's also an avenue, but we can put some links up, no problem.
Wonderful. I'm going to unpack a few key takeaways that I'm hearing from both, and I'm going to go in reverse order. So we stick with this industry and food choices example, and then think about your first example from a pet parenting lens. So when it comes to these stories, they're incredibly powerful. Thank you so much for sharing them. The first is just for those that are perhaps new to understanding the dairy industry. Some key elements of what Fritha just walked through are: number one, cows don't just produce milk as a product, right? The way that the dairy industry operates is that cows are becoming pregnant, carrying a calf to term, delivering that calf. And then there is the question of at what time point is that calf being separated from the cow for that milk to then be routed as product for humans as opposed to consumed by the calf in a traditional model. And what Fritha is describing is an innovation that addresses the question that I get often, which is, I want to continue eating animal products, but I want to do it in the most humane way. What does that look like? And that question is going to vary depending on the industry. And that question may have challenges in and of itself, as we were discussing with chickens and the lived experience of chickens by the simple way that they're bred. When it comes to a key consideration for dairy, there is that example that Fritha is highlighting here in terms of separating a mother and her calf in a very short period of time after delivering that calf. I've heard many mothers talk about how this really resonated for them after they gave birth. And when we think about the questions that are being raised here, if there is an opportunity to not only extend that time period, but actually extend it to a period almost as long as what we would see in nature, is what you're describing, just recognizing this is not a natural environment, right? But when we're thinking about the typical mother calf bond, that there would eventually be a weaning period. And so farms that are moving toward a model where that calf gets to stay with its mother benefits the calf, benefits the mother. And it sounds like also benefits the industry, because we have seen tremendous pressure on the dairy industry, decreasing demand over decades, at least in the US, in terms of the data that we can include with some links on this as well. So there's an incentive for farmers to think about innovating in this way that would simultaneously offer an opportunity to be a win for the farmers because they can increase that price point. As you mentioned, they are providing tremendous value. But for those interested in supporting animal welfare in their purchasing decisions, this is one new way we haven't yet talked about that I think is incredibly compelling, and we'll make sure we include some links on that. Anything that I'm mischaracterizing or that you would add in terms of those takeaways for people that are new to dairy choices and the animal welfare components of dairy?
Yes, I think the problem with dairy is that it's very difficult to make choices on an individual farm basis unless you have access to these farmers that are doing things that are quite unusual at present. The huge majority of us in the UK and the US will go to a supermarket and buy milk, which will be from multiple farms because of the way in which milk is processed and the way in which milk is sold in these two countries. So it is more tricky perhaps than some other choices that we can make. And so when we go into that in more detail, we can outline the sorts of choices that might be available to consumers. And so it is a bit tricky on the dairy front. However, there are, as I say, a number of farms, and that number is growing year on year, who are wanting to do something different. And understanding that there are sustainability issues, of course, with cattle farming in general, dairy farming in particular, and some severe animal welfare problems that can be addressed partially in some of the ways in which we farm cattle, but maybe more fully addressed in the example I told you about.
Thank you. And just quickly, in terms of the first example you raised, the key takeaway for me in hearing you describe what caused you pain, what caused you concern when you were looking at this farm in particular and the lived experiences of these cows is that these cows, for various reasons, including wounds, including age related health and mobility and well
Mhm.
being concerns, should have been euthanized and were not. And the rationale for that from the farmer was that these cows meant a tremendous amount to the farmer, that they had been with the farmer for a tremendous amount of time, and that the farmer couldn't part with those cows.
That's right.
And I want to highlight this. It is very important. I'm very glad you're speaking to cows. Cows are sentient, amazing creatures. And when we talk about sentience, what we mean is they have value in and of themselves. And so I'm so glad that we are talking about cows. And just like the dairy example often resonates with women who have given birth from examples I have seen in many different contexts. I think this example really resonated deeply with me from the very early weeks of learning from you and the iWell team through the University of Edinburgh. And what I mean by that is for many of us with our pets, we can start to think about our pets as our kids. And I do. So I recognize that there's a tremendous difference, an important difference between human children and our animals. And for me, they are who I care for. They have a number of different considerations. And we can think about that in a positive way in terms of the care we bring to our animals. And we can also at times put ourselves ahead of our animals' needs. And we can think about wanting our animal to quote unquote make it to a certain age, right? We may think about not being able to part with our animal because of the grief and distress that will cause us. But I think the example that you're raising is so incredibly important and something you helped to instill in me in that program that I'm so grateful to have had the time and ability to reflect on in advance so that when it came time to make decisions, the end of life for my dog, that I was able to have very direct conversations with my veterinary team and hear them when they said, it's time.
Mhm.
And that was hard. It was
Yeah.
very painful. And my immediate gut reaction was like, it can't possibly be time. Right. But I thankfully had your coaching and guidance and plenty of frameworks to think about this from the program, but also deeply committed veterinary team who I trusted and had built that communication with in advance to say, I need you to be comfortable and know that I will work and hear you. And I want to know when you feel that time is. And in hindsight, that was a tremendous gift because I can look back on that and know that he did not experience discomfort because of any waiting on my part for my own reasons, whatever they might have been. And so I say this because I think these are themes that are very difficult to hear and it may take time for people to reflect upon. But the example you're describing is so incredibly important for anyone with an animal in their care. And we see this in the veterinary space. And we see that there can be a tremendous amount of suffering at the end of an animal's life for a variety of different reasons, because the more compassionate choice for that animal would have been euthanasia. And greatly appreciate you mentioning this. And I recognize that I'm compounding the sadness of what you had mentioned, but I think it's an incredibly important message and one for all
Mhm.
of us to continue to reflect on. And I try to talk about my experiences with my own dog, and it still brings me to tears, but I at least know that he had a compassionate veterinarian guided passing at the time that was appropriate for him. And that anything after that would have been me prioritizing my own needs and not his. And there is peace and gratitude in that, as difficult as it was at the time.
And unfortunately, many of us will reach that very difficult conclusion with our companion animals. They don't live long enough, right? And it's so sad. We have to make these decisions, and those decisions aren't easy to make. There are quite interesting cultural differences to how important or right we might think euthanasia decisions are. But I think in terms of considering severe suffering, then have to think of that as an option.
Thank you so much. I want to switch topics a bit here. Fish welfare is a topic that we know often gets overlooked in discussions about animal welfare.
It really does.
What are your thoughts on the current state of fish welfare? And want to intentionally keep that word fish broad so we can think about a variety of different aspects of aquatic beings. I would love to hear your thoughts on the current state and then have a few follow-up questions for you on this as well.
Fish welfare is a topic that is growing in interest in terms of science and also other actors, including non-governmental organizations, because it is something that we have, for many good reasons, left until last, shall we say, within farming, but also within other sectors as well. And those good reasons are because it's really difficult. For lots of interconnected reasons, fish don't live in the same environment that we do, and we don't necessarily understand their biology in quite the same way, or the way in which they experience their life in the same way that we are starting to get a handle of animals that perhaps are more similar to us. Now, of course, fish, as in actual fish, is quite a broad category anyway. We're talking about tiny fish that are less than an inch long to huge whale sharks, and everything in between are fish. And they all have perhaps different experiences. They certainly have quite varied biology. Some live in freshwater, some live in seawater, and there's very big differences between those. And then, of course, with you also thinking potentially about uh, aquaculture that may include invertebrates, non-vertebrate fish, non-fin fish. So things like prawns or lobsters or mussels or oysters, all sorts of areas to unpack there. So quite tricky. The good thing is that people are recognizing now, and let's start with finfish, that fish are sentient. So within European law, and I include the UK in that, obviously, we're not necessarily in the EU anymore, we're not at all in the EU, but from our legislation point of view, quite a lot of those laws were written when we were. In European law, fish are considered sentient beings. Any vertebrate within human care comes under that broad category of what is sentient. And I think now that the majority of the science evidence is showing that fish can definitely feel, experience, remember emotions, particularly to do with pain and fear. We're less certain in terms of happier emotions, unfortunately, but at least we're starting to understand that fish do have an emotional life. That one might be quite different from what you and I experience, but it means that we have to consider their welfare more, I think, than perhaps we used to, and that we ought to consider what it means for the fish to be in different situations.
Fish feel
We're
pain,
also
right?
sorry, what was
So fish feel pain.
exactly. And we
Yes.
also know from our colleagues in biology that they have quite complex cognitive abilities. So are able to do and remember and problem solve different tasks in quite astonishing abilities. And that the whole myth of a 3-second memory is very definitely consigned to myth rather than reality. So we have animals that have good memory, often extremely good visual ability, They can feel in a completely different way than we can because they feel vibrations through their lateral line. They sometimes can feel and communicate through their swim bladders that, of course, we have no concept of what that might feel as a human being. So yes, biology of a very different animal. But just because it's very different doesn't mean we shouldn't give them consideration when we are using, keeping, and interacting with different fish. One of the industries in which fish factor, obviously there is sea fishing. So what I mean by that is trawling or nets to get fish from the ocean, sometimes from freshwater, in order to eat them. We also have fish farming. That can be in the sea, it can be in a freshwater environment, or it can even be on land in a tank. And all of those are used. It's an enormous industry. It's growing far faster than any other farming industry. It's bigger than any other farming industry, bigger even than the chicken. So there are more fish farmed than there are other livestock farmed. So it's a huge industry. So we've got fishing from the wild, we've got farmed fish. We also have a lot of fish within our industry, within science. They're, they have a very quick, particularly the species that is most commonly used, which is the zebrafish, has a very quick gestational turnaround, so can grow new fish very quickly. You can get large numbers in a very small area, and they have genetics which are fairly easy to manipulate. And so they have become one of the preferred models for science. So there's actually more fish in science than there are mice and rats. There's a lot of fish in laboratory situations. And then the other one, which I think often people forget, is that there are an awful lot of pet fish in the world. Ornamental fish by number, as in individuals, are the most popular fish, the most popular pet in the world. And in the UK every year, there's around about 20 million fish sold into pet industry. So yeah, we have 4 industries there. I'm sure there are more, but just for the interests of time, those are the ones we can consider the most. And of course, there are wild animals in the wild, and that is another complication as to how much interaction they may have with humans and human-related products. But okay, so in terms of fish welfare, the good news, as I say, is we're starting to understand it a little better. The bad news is we're not necessarily applying it in all of these industries equally. In terms of trawled fish, there are obviously huge sustainability issues with fishing, particularly with large-scale fishing boats and how they collect fish from the ocean. They call it a harvest, of course. So in terms of the bycatch and the way in which they can clear the bottom of the sea, depending on the types of equipment they're using. And not only that, but when we're thinking about welfare, those animals are being brought onto the boat in order to die. They are not being killed at that point. So in terms of the humaneness, if you can allow me to use that term, of their death, it's likely to be very poor. Some of these fish will have been taken from a very cold, very high pressure environment and lifted into a much warmer, low pressure environment. So considering the pressure differential could be quite painful. We don't actually know. There's all sorts of things that the fish could experience during the trawling that we just have no understanding. So I think in terms of where our scientific understanding of fish welfare happens, it's not really in the wild fish capture. But we know that obviously the death part is probably going to be prolonged and not particularly pleasant. Alongside that, of course, all those sustainability issues. However, those animals have led a wild life before then, so at least their expression of natural behaviours has been fully allowed for. So one could say that they've had opportunities to have a good life, or at least a life worth living before they were captured.
So essentially, what you're saying is there are different questions when we think about the lived experience and the welfare of any animal, including fish.
Correct.
One of those is this question of a life worth living,
Hmm.
as we mentioned earlier, thinking about the lived experience from a variety of different factors. And a second is did the animal have a quote unquote good death in the sense that what you're describing here would presumably not fall in that category
No,
because of the extended period of time, because of the sheer nature of the process and the lack of process involved
correct. Correct.
in the end
So
of it.
it's likely to be prolonged, and awareness is likely to be there for a prolonged period of time as well. So there's no attempt at making those animals unconscious quickly so that the awareness is reduced. However, of course, some animals are put onto ice, which may reduce their awareness and potentially feelings, as in the literal nervous sensation, but we don't know enough about it to really say. When we think of fish farming, and I have to admit that my experience is mostly with salmonids, which is very common in the UK and in Norway, but is actually not a very big industry in most of the world. So that's quite a small part of fin fish farming. But in farming, we are carrying out all of those processes. So the breeding of animals, the raising of them, and the raising and growing and fattening to a slaughter weight in a human mediated environment. And that does mean that there's more control. And one big thing we're seeing with farmed fish, and particularly in salmonids, so that is salmon and trout, is that we're seeing thought and experimental design and then input of more humane slaughter techniques. So where we see some of the big problems in fish capture from the wild is in the death bit. We don't really know how much those animals are going to experience that problem. But in these more human mediated environments, we can be quite controlling of that. And we can carry that out in such a way that hopefully the process of slaughter is as quick and as painless as possible. It's not going to be pain free. It's not going to be that quick because you still have to move the animal from the environment which you're keeping it to the slaughter facilities. But at least there are some opportunities for reducing welfare harm in that process. Interestingly, the big companies that are running these farms are really interested in welfare assessment. So that is the ability to carry out day-to-day monitoring of those animals to maintain welfare at present and maybe even improve it if there's disease issues to be able to catch those early. And that has been lagging behind other farmed animal species because it's really hard to see the fish, mainly because they're kept in huge, salmons anyway, are kept in huge cages in the sea. So you can't see the animals and you can't see very many of them, the ones that are at the surface and not the ones that you necessarily need to worry about. Where we spoke about AI and technologies earlier, this is a real potential for improving animal welfare in the fish farming industry. So using imaging techniques and then training computers through machine learning to recognize when there are changes which require somebody to go and do something about. So we can use sonar to understand where the fish are within a sea cage system. And we can use quite sophisticated imaging techniques to see the way in which the animals are swimming. And funnily enough, as with any animals, when there are welfare issues that are happening, there are usually behavioral signs of those welfare issues. And you can see changes in swimming, changes in social behavior, changes in where the animals are within an environment. And those can all help us to help the farmer to make changes there and then to reduce the impact of future welfare problems. So that's great, and there's a lot of work going on in that at present. But of course, the huge majority of finfish that are farmed aren't salmonids. There's carp, catfish, tilapia, and often they are on land. So they're quite, they can be quite circular industries, would you believe? So you can maintain quite a lot of energy in the system and not have very much waste from those industries. So in terms of sustainability, they can sometimes be quite a lot more sustainable than you might expect from keeping a whole load of fish in tanks on land. But there are still quite a lot of problems in terms of welfare assessments because it's very difficult to, as I say, to see animals. In terms of stocking density, i.e., the numbers of animals per unit of space, they're often kept at very high stocking rates. But then fish in some natural systems also are in quite high stocking densities at certain times of year. So sometimes that mirrors natural behavior and sometimes it doesn't. Catfish are particularly resilient to all sorts of things, and because they have the ability to process air as well as oxygen from a water environment, then there is unfortunately sometimes a tendency to have slightly lower quality water. So more fish waste in the water, for example, because it's less of a problem for the animals to deal with in a farmed environment. So there's pluses and minuses with finfish in farmed systems.
So, coming back to your earlier point, in other species that we can optimize for certain things in industry and an animal may be able to cope. However, that still raises other issues or at least questions when it comes to the welfare of the animal and the individual animal's lived experience in these settings.
That's right. That's right.
To ask a bit more directly, is we know that we're seeing some of the approaches we've talked about earlier in terms of alternative proteins,
Hmm.
in terms of cellular agriculture for aquatic life. And for our listeners, we may see terms related to cell based fish. We may see terms related to cellular aquaculture. And these have been highlighted as potential solutions to many fish welfare issues, and certainly also come with their own set of challenges and complexities, including needed research and development. What are some of the animal welfare implications to farmed fish when we think about why do we need these potential solutions and what measures can we take to improve the well-being of fish in diverse environments, including aquaculture or fish farming,
Hmm.
especially given that it's going to take some time to continue to explore and address some of the complexities you've already mentioned when we think about cell-based fish, in this case, cell-based agriculture in other cases.
Yes, and as far as I'm aware, it's a little bit behind the cellular aquaculture compared with that we might see for chicken or for beef. There's been an awful lot of money put into the production of cellular chicken or cellular beef, which perhaps hasn't been there for fish so far, but is certainly growing. And I think we'll see an awful lot more of that in the next 5 to 10 years. Why are there welfare problems within farmed fish? Partly, as I've said previously, it's very difficult to see those animals as individuals, partly because there's huge numbers of them, and partly because you can't actually see them very easily, and it's more difficult to pick them up and do something about it. And we don't necessarily understand or always consider the way in which those fish are going to react to different environmental changes because they do that very differently to us. Fortunately, I do have a degree in marine biology, so my understanding of fish behavior is a little bit higher than perhaps it could have been. But one of the things that we have to understand is that for different species of fish, temperature can really impact them. And this, of course, is going to become more and more of an issue as we see warming of seas and climate change in general. For example, even in farmed fish that are on land in tanks, there may well have to be more cooling for those tanks in future years when temperatures go higher and therefore more energy in terms of producing them. So for sustainability, there are issues as well. In terms of welfare, numbers, difficulties in understanding them. At all points, there are potential welfare harms in as much as animals can become stressed in the situations in which they're kept, we're obviously keeping them in a very artificial environment. We are There are some issues that aren't necessarily as big a problem for fish as they may be for other animals. So most of the fish species that we do farm are not ones where there is parental care in a wild type environment. So the fact that we don't raise our baby fish with the mother fish is not a problem, whereas it might be in other environments which we farm. But there are issues with pain. There are problems to do with water quality or with other fish interactions which can cause pain. We sometimes see what's called fin nipping in fish that are becoming stressed. They're much more likely to nibble bits of other fish. And you sometimes see problem individuals that will go and do that. They get a taste for it, as it were. It's something more interesting to do. These are often very barren environments, and perhaps fish are become frustrated with the barren environments and start taking little chunks out of everybody else. That can then lead to infection and pain as well. And so, yeah, the problem of not being able to treat those animals as individuals, I think, is one of the biggest ones for fish farms. So when there is an issue with a fish, it's very hard to pick that individual out and do something with it. So even with our chickens, a farmer should be able to walk up to it and be able to pick it out of the myriad of other chickens if there is something wrong with it. But you can't do that with fish, not necessarily. And so when there are those sort of problems, then it can go catastrophically wrong for that individual. And often you get problems with cannibalism as well. So fish eating other fish, not just nibbling a chunk out, but actually eating one another. Interestingly, that's also a problem for our non-fin seafood. So, for example, when they are kept in situations where they become stressed, one of the first signs that you can see that's the case is that you have fewer of them. The reason you have fewer of them is because they start eating one another. So it's very brutal, really, but that is the reality here, is that it's very difficult to see those early warning systems, which is why the big companies in fish farms are very interested in AI technology to be able to do that. And it's very difficult to solve problems when you have them. So preventing problems is the most important thing with fish farming.
Certainly makes sense. When you think about the current state of things, what measures can be taken to improve the well-being of fish in these diverse environments? But in particular, when we think about current fish farming practices, recognizing the challenges that you just mentioned,
Mm.
what are some steps we can take?
I think using the technology that is available now to be able to understand fish behavior is something that we can really use to then help systems to be as good as they can be. Water quality is the single most important factor for fish. They're breathing that water, they're living in that water, their skin can absorb some of that water. So thinking about water quality is really important, whether that be in a tank on land or in a sea environment. And then disease. So thinking about good biosecurity. What does good biosecurity mean, though, for a fish in a sea cage where the environment it's in is constantly washing through? It's quite tricky to think. And one thing that we have seen in less good practice is then dosing, quite significant dosing of those fish with medications in order to cover up problems. And therefore, of course, those medications are also going into the environment. So that's problematic. There are ways to think about certain problems that we see in a cleverer way, I think. So what we're seeing in the salmon industry is one of the big problems in terms of parasites is something called the sea lice. They attach onto the sort of weaker parts of the fish where there are joins in the body parts. So, for example, in the gills and around the eyes, and around the mouth, and they're horrible little things, really. And one of the ways to reduce those within the sea cage is to have a natural solution. The natural solution being a cleaning wrasse fish. So you can breed cleaner wrasses to go into the sea cages with the salmon, and they pick off the parasites, which is great as long as their welfare is also looked at. And interestingly, there are now welfare assessments that are starting to become available for the farming of wrasse to put into sea cages. So you can see there's a lot of work there. I think I'm actually often quite surprised at how joined up the industry is on fish welfare and fish welfare assessments. I think they do take it quite seriously, which is good, obviously. And I think they are trying to use those types of assessments to the best ability that they can at present, obviously to in order to maximize profitability of the farm, but also to maintain a good as image as possible from the public. Because I think the public can recognize that, yeah, sometimes these fish farms are not the best places for those animals. And I think the environmental concerns also, it weighs heavy on consumers. And again, I'm talking quite a lot about the salmon industry, and I know that won't necessarily be the most important industry in all of your listeners' different countries that they might be in. So I do apologize for that. But it is possibly the farm fish industry which has gone the furthest so far in terms of thinking about animal welfare.
Absolutely. An example to think about emulating and
Yeah.
building
Yeah.
upon for other species. Absolutely. I'd like to draw on some of your other areas of expertise for this next question. When we think about your expertise in farm animal welfare and companion animal care,
Mhm.
how do you see the intersections between these domains? And what can each learn from the other to advance animal welfare more broadly?
Mm. Yeah. I think that's a really important question because sometimes we get quite siloed in the ways in which we think, and actually meeting other people from other disciplines, even if it's just thinking about animal welfare in different disciplines, can be really helpful. As my main area of interest is in farm animal welfare, though I do quite a lot of work with companion animals, particularly with the humans who look after companion animals, and also sometimes laboratory animals and sometimes animals in captivity as well. And what I would like to think is that one thing that farm animal welfare has brought to those other sectors is the rigor in which animal welfare science is undertaken. So considering 20 years ago, the quality of science around companion animals was not always very high. There were some fantastic examples, but a lot of examples where experimental design hadn't been thought through very well. And if you don't think through experimental design or the way in which you carry out a study, the results of that are less applicable or less trustable. And so having good conditions in which to carry out a study on animal welfare is really important. And I think that's one thing that we've learned an awful lot from farm animal welfare that's really useful in these other sectors. One of the things that I think has been a really interesting development that's come the other way, particularly from companion animals into farm animals, is really considering the human animal bond. We often thought in farm animals that all that the human was doing was moving them and carrying out mutilations or other procedures on farm animals and not necessarily having that care. But even that example I gave you earlier, where the farmer loved his animals but wasn't able to see that was taking things too far with those animals, shows the importance of human animal bond within farm animals. So I think farm animal welfare is really learning from the science, but also just generally the sector of companion animals. And that's something that has added tremendous value.
Absolutely. I think even thinking about our discussion today and the parallels we're drawing
Yes.
between caring for a cow and caring for a dog or a cat, and how we can think about the benefits that come from the rigor you mentioned that may have been prompted by industry factors that don't apply, right? When we think about the reasons we have companion animals, and yet what we can learn from that in terms of our overall processes and in terms of improving not only the welfare of the animals in our care, but enhancing the bond we have with our animals. And then certainly applying what we know and love about bonding with our companion animals to recognizing the important bonding that can happen between farmers and the animals in their care, and certainly in other spaces as well. You touched briefly on research.
Mhm.
We see that in research environments too, right?
We
And
do. A quick example of that is where we're learning that different handling methods for our laboratory rodents are really important to those rodents. They massively reduce the stress of moving from one environment to another, but often you need to do some form of handling for whatever the procedure is. So, for example, if you're taking a blood test, you need to be able to handle the animals to do. And we understand now that you can use a sort of tube-based handling system where the animal can go into a tube and you can hold it, and then that animal feels much less stressed than the traditional, which for mice was picking them up by their tail and holding them above the hand. And that was really commonly done. And what we're finding is that the people who work with those laboratory animals, those laboratory technicians and other scientists who are working with those animals, enjoy working with animals more when they are less stressed. The animals. It also reduces the stress that is felt by the humans who are involved with the new handling techniques. And I think
absolutely,
that's a really nice example to show that not only do welfare improvements improve the animals' lives, but they also can improve the humans who are dealing with those animals in whatever capacity they may be dealing with them.
absolutely. And the results, right? When we know that we're reducing that stress, we're getting more consistent and in some cases even better results
Absolutely. So
from a
better
yes.
science by, funnily enough, not stressing our animals. Yeah, it's taken us a long time to learn that, unfortunately, but I think, yeah, there is definitely recognition now that the better we keep our animals in laboratories, the more consequence the science has for future development.
We mentioned we would come to this eventually. When we think about that role consumers play in driving positive change for animal welfare, what role do they play when it comes to food production systems and the food choices that they make? What about the companion animal caregiver perspective? And how can we as individuals make informed choices to support more ethical and sustainable practices? Coming back to your very first points in the foods we purchase and consume and the ways we care for our pets.
Big questions here, Erin. But yeah, I think consumers have a key role in thinking about both of these areas, both the food in which that we consume, so the food that is produced for us to eat, and particularly in the food that we buy for our pet animals, our companion animals to eat. Those are two areas that we as consumers can have a direct impact on the production systems. It can take some time for that consumer action to lead to wide scale change. Let me first start with saying that again, I'll focus perhaps on UK, US type of situation rather than elsewhere in the world because obviously, as we know, people's ability to make different food choices will be really severely affected by where they are, the availability and the budget constraints that they may have, and to acknowledge that there are an awful lot of people in the UK and US who aren't able to make choices with their food because of the way that they don't have the money or perhaps access to information that others may have. So we need to acknowledge that they've got some fantastic colleagues at Newcastle that are doing some really important work in food deserts, which I don't know if you've heard of this concept, but it's where people in the most disadvantaged part of society here in the UK, but also in the US, are most likely to live in places where there's no access to fresh food. So the food that is available is often not very healthy for them, not very sustainable for the planet, and often poor animal welfare as well. So let's have all of those caveats in place. So we're talking here about people who do have some, sometimes more limited than others, but some budgetary choice to make different decisions. but also availability choice. So there are choices available in their environment. So what can you do? I think the consumer role can sometimes be overrated. We can only choose what we have in front of us, and sometimes that is still quite limited. I made the example of dairy products before. Unless you seek out certain producers who are producing things in a different way, you will get a very standardized dairy product in your local supermarket. And it's very difficult to choose something different. As where we have these situations where consumers can't make a big difference, I think this is a real step for government or large corporations to make a difference in terms of legislation, perhaps. That's particularly a thing we see in the UK and EU, and perhaps more corporates making business decisions, perhaps something we see more frequently in the US compared to legislation. So again, that is one problem area, is that consumers don't always have a great deal of choice. However, there are quite a lot of things that we can do as consumers, and I think sometimes we don't see how quickly our choices can impact things. But I'll give you an example. It's quite an old example, but I think it's quite a useful one. And that is of the change in system for laying hens. Yes, I'm back to chickens again, but in the 1980s in the UK, and then a follow on into the. What happened was a member of parliament, so one of our legislative bodies, made the comment that a lot of eggs had salmonella present in them. In fact, the comment was something along the lines of the majority of eggs in British egg production contain salmonella. Regardless of the veracity of that statement, that had an overnight effect in that the egg sales dropped. And what people started to do was to change the type of eggs that they bought. So the sales of free range eggs went up. The sales of ordinary eggs, which at the time were in the barren battery cage that we still see in most of the world, went down. And within a few weeks, the situation that we saw in the UK was that people were trying to get hold of free range eggs and weren't getting enough of them because the systems were still quite low in terms of their number and the proportion of eggs that were being produced by those systems in the UK. And there was a huge drive to change to a cage free system. Just in a very short space of time, consumers that had been alerted to a problem through a news item on the TV, in the newspapers, etc., long time before the internet, and had seen media images of what barren battery cages look like, made decisions that they didn't want to be part of that anymore. Now, there was a human health element as well, being the salmonella. Ironically, free range eggs are much more likely to have salmonella in them than cage eggs. But that's by the by. The decision by the consumers was to go to non-cage systems. And what that did was, over time, persuade governments that it was important to make that change, that the consumers really wanted access to free range and they wanted it labeled so they could make those choices. And they didn't want barren battery cages anymore. And so in 2013, so I was talking about the 1980s there, 2013, we saw one of the biggest welfare changes that has happened in the past 25 years since I've been working in animal welfare, where the barren battery cage was banned throughout the EU, which included the UK at the time. And those cages, which really restrict hen behaviour, cause a lot of stress and frustration and injury and you name it. It's not a great environment for chickens, was removed from across the EU, thereby improving the welfare of chickens, hundreds of millions of chickens, ever since. Now, I'm not saying all chickens live a fabulous life laying hens. They don't. But what that shows is that both the individual consumer was able to make a choice. That then drove change, which then led to government decisions and legislation. I believe that it's possible to do the same in other areas of animal welfare and sustainability, that our individual buying habits do matter. And that if we are able to do that, we should try and take a better option if we can. If we have it within us in terms of our budgets, in terms of availability, then we ought to. If we think it's important, we should do it. And obviously, from a climate change point of view, and particularly when we're looking at US and UK diets, one of the biggest changes we could do is reduce our meat, dairy, and eggs, particularly meat and dairy. Eggs are generally a very good food in terms of nutrition. You could argue all sorts of things, but most nutritionists think that eggs are quite good to have in the diet. But we know that eating a lot of meat can actually be quite harmful, and dairy is somewhere in the middle. But we could certainly reduce that. And in doing so, we send quite strong messages to the farming systems that we're not wanting that level of environmental harm. So I think we do have really good opportunities as consumers. However, the most important um, element of consumer choice is when there's collective action rather than just individual. Because when we see collective action, we see a much greater unit of change. For example, the Meat Free Monday campaign. I'm not sure how big that is in the US, but it's certainly quite a big thing in the UK, where you perhaps have a vegetarian diet for a Monday. It's just a nice, easy, with the alliteration of meat and Monday, so nicely everybody can remember it. We see it quite a lot in our schools here in the UK, and that can reduce our reliance on animal products. It's amazing, just one day can make quite a big difference. So I think that is important for consumers to realise, is that the US and UK diet is not ideal, and that we do have a lot of meat, particularly in the US. I know that is levelling off, but I think going from the highest pretty much of anywhere in the world, that it can't really go any higher. So it probably is going to level off, but to reduce that would be extremely good.
Absolutely.
Ideally, you choose a better welfare product. If you're still eating meat and dairy, then to choose something which could offer those animals a potential for a better life would be the way to carry on eating those products. You might reduce in terms of number, but you eat better. So less but better would be the thing that I would urge people who have the ability to do so to try and do.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Certainly agree that any shift to plant based choices, including one day a week, makes a huge difference. And we can include some of the resources you've mentioned. I've also really appreciate your point about the choices that we make and want to highlight that includes grocery store decisions, right? Which may be clearer in terms of some areas where there are some certifications available, as well as eating out. And we've recently highlighted an example of McDonald's shifting away from battery cages to cage free, and certainly hope to continue to see companies using that as a point of differentiation and highlighting that they're hearing consumers that want better animal welfare choices, and that reduction needs to be part of the conversation as well, including from a human health and nutrition perspective. And I can share some links from my recent certification through Harvard Medical School that helped to illustrate that as well. So thank you so much for speaking to that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resources out there, and everything is starting to point in the same direction. So it's not saying that you have to completely change your diet if you're, for example, sometimes for health reasons, needing to have some animal products in your diet. Some people do, but please think about the reduction of meat and dairy. For cats and dogs, however, now it's quite a thorny subject. Obviously, when we're talking about cats and dogs, and when I say companion animals, I'm going to focus on cats and dogs. Obviously, we have other animals that perhaps don't eat meat and they are perhaps easier to feed. But cats and dogs are both carnivorous animals by their very taxon, and in the wild would consume other animals. And cats are what we call obligate carnivores in as much as they can't produce certain amino acids without having access to those amino acids in their diet. And generally, you get them only from animal products. However, there is quite a lot of work on the way in which we can reduce some of the environmental footprints regarding cat and dog food. Would you believe it's around 20% for consumers in the US and the UK, around 20% of our food-based carbon footprint is in feeding our pets. It's a huge amount. And people often think, oh, it's just waste products that are being fed to my pets, but that isn't necessarily true. There's in such huge numbers that quite a high percentage of the animals that we keep really we wouldn't have if we weren't feeding them to our dogs or cats. So it is an important area to think about. Of course, we think, oh, it's natural to feed our pets on the cat food or the dog food that we're getting from our retailer. But I do often wonder how much a cat would maybe prefer a tin of mouse compared to a tin of lamb, say. I don't know if I could imagine my cat taking down a tuna all by herself. That would be quite difficult for her to do, I think. So, yes, we're not feeding a natural diet to our dogs and cats. We know that dogs in the wild eat a lot of invertebrates. They eat a lot of scavenging products, which would include already dead things, so carrion. And so that, which is why they actually have quite sort of good constitutions in being able to eat all sorts of horrible things. But yeah, so what we feed them is perhaps it's quite difficult because there is, I think, nutritionally balanced if we're getting pet food that has come through the regulations that it needs to in terms of providing a diet for cats and dogs. So I'm not saying stop feeding pet food. What I'm saying is we need to consider the diet that we feed our animals. So there's quite a lot of work now in reducing the meat content of dog food in particular, because as I say, dogs have a very wide variety of things in their diet as a feral or a wild animal. And therefore, they're much more able to eat plant-based products as well as meat-based products. So we could go down a similar route in terms of reducing the amount of meat that animals eat. So we could have food that includes both plant-based and animal-based products in the same package. Interestingly, I was recently at a meeting where we were discussing this, and the evidence seems to suggest that dry food, such as kibble, is much more environmentally friendly than wet fruit.
I want to make sure I'm summarizing what you're saying. So, when we think about what is in our pet food, we may focus on the certifications, the processes that are in place to ensure complete and balanced. And that matters when it comes to ensuring pets have nutrients. However, what you're saying is what we are feeding our animals, whether we're talking about cats or dogs in these cases, or we could certainly explore other species as well. What we're feeding cats and dogs does not directly align with what cats or dogs would eat on their own, whether we're talking about the mice example for cats, whether we're talking about the particular species, whether we're thinking about fish, whether we're thinking about lamb, et cetera. We can have the same discussion for dogs. And I just want to unpack what you're saying about plants as directly as I can for listeners, which is that we know that there is an ongoing effort and there's an opportunity to increase the amount of plants in the foods we provide, both dogs and cats. And there are important distinctions when we think about the amino acid needs of cats
Mhm.
and how that is derived from animal products, the wider opportunity for exploring ingredients and plant based options for dogs. Am I summarizing that accurately?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's quite important to say at the moment the evidence for cats is not as clear. And at present, I personally am not comfortable in recommending a diet that massively reduces meat for cats. There is some evidence, there's growing evidence, but it's not clear yet. And we know that certain ages of cats, it seems actually a little dangerous. So I think it would be tricky for me to advocate that we should do some form of plant-based replacement for cats. I know there are some advocates out there that would say that would be a good idea, but I'm not sure that I completely agree that the evidence is quite so clear yet. And I know that there can be severe problems. And I have veterinary colleagues in small animal practice that will tell you of quite sad cases where people have tried to replace a diet of cats and it hasn't gone well for the cat. I'm much more confident talking about dogs in this particular space, that dogs are much better able to cope with an omnivorous diet. And that omnivorous diet can actually be quite low in meat products and still be healthy for dogs. And there is increase in possibilities for producing meat-free or very low meat diets for dogs. However, as I pointed out before, this is often in wet food, and that actually in terms of carbon footprint, we know that kibble, dry food, is, I think it was around 40 times lower carbon footprint than wet food. And there's lots of different reasons. And one of the reasons is it's lighter to transport. Sure. So there's all sorts of things that go into making up the sort of environmental footprint for a product. And one of those is how heavy it is in terms of transporting it around the country. So there's lots of different decisions for animal keepers to make, and I think part of it is watch this space, because there's so much research going on at the moment in this area that I think, again, in a few years' time, we'll be at a much clearer point as to how healthful plant-based diets are for dogs and potentially for cats. I think if you are somebody who really struggles with feeding a meat-based diet to an obligate carnivore, perhaps it's time to choose a different pet. There are other companion animals that don't require those sorts of diets, and I love cats. I have always had cats, but I think that at the moment it's not clear. As I say, there are advocates out there that will say that the evidence is getting stronger and stronger all the time, and I think that probably is the case, but I cannot endorse a plant-based diet for cats, just as long as
I
they're
I
good.
hear you. Yes, and just to add my own, I know we're at time, but just to add my own
Yeah.
caveat here, I've spoken previously about how I do not feel the research is there yet, and I've actually said for dogs and cats. So I'm curious to learn more and continue understanding the research in terms of dogs and plant-based options. And I think there is, as you mentioned, opportunities to explore what that looks like from an omnivore's perspective, reducing some of the meat content, increasing the plant-based. My I'm a vegan. I have been vegan for over 6 years, and I feed my cat Royal Canin hydrolyzed protein cat food, which certainly includes meat. So I certainly hear you that I think when it comes to the questions we ask of ourselves, an important step in that process that I was grateful to examine as part of your teaching and the Iowa program is looking at our own decisions for our own food choices as separate from the needs of our animal and looking at our animal as an individual, just as we've talked about throughout this conversation, and their species specific needs as well as their individual needs. And I give my cat specific food as an example because his allergies dictate his food. So that is certainly about him as opposed to my veganism, which applies only to me and not to him. And I share that just to give an example because I think so many times we can think about our own behaviors, food, fitness, otherwise,
Yeah.
and apply those to our animal. And we really need to think of each individual
It's a
distinctly.
completely sensible way to think about it, that their experience is different from yours. They are not mini humans. They have different species specific needs. And yeah, there's growing evidence, but it's not there yet. So let's carry on finding out more, endeavoring to do better. But yeah, it is a big problem, and I don't think we've answered it yet, that we have a lot of companion animals and they provide so much joy in our human lives. And Hopefully we do well by them. Not always, but hopefully we try. But they have a large carbon footprint in and of themselves.
Absolutely. And I just want to clarify one other thing that you mentioned. I'm
Mhm,
interpreting your comment about exploring these questions of the food we provide our pets, both in terms of our current pets, but also in terms of forward-looking decisions. And when you're
mm,
talking about the piece around what pet to select, I'm hearing you saying that as far as a forward-looking consideration for
mm.
someone planning to adopt an animal, as opposed to we're not suggesting relinquishing an animal. I just want to make
No,
sure. Yeah,
no, absolutely not. Definitely in terms of future planning as opposed to what you have already. Please don't relinquish your pet because of anything I say. Also, if you're forward planning, think about smaller dog.
it's a bit
Smaller dogs
smaller footprint.
eat much less food than bigger dogs and therefore have a greater sustainability index than a larger dog. They also
Thank
live longer.
thank you for walking through that. I don't mean to
No,
unpack
no.
particular details. I just want to make sure we're
We
leaving
have to be clear,
our
very
listeners with
much so.
clarity.
I'm very
Yes,
aware of that. Absolutely.
yes. So in short, the evidence is not there to suggest plant-based choices for cats at this stage. There is increasing exploration around incorporating more plants for
Mhm,
dogs in an omnivore type strategy.
mhm,
And in thinking about these questions for your own animal, we have opportunities to think about the sustainability of our choices at multiple vantage points, including the food that we provide. And certainly when we're thinking about hopefully adopting a new
mhm,
animal,
mhm.
and the considerations from a sustainability perspective could include the size of the animal, this species, and what we would ideally be feeding that animal and more. Is that a fair
Absolutely. That
summary?
is
Okay,
100% perfect summary.
wonderful. Where can our listeners go to learn more about you and your work and your research?
Yes, and I think also more about animal welfare if they want to consider it as a form of study. About me, probably the best way for the general public to learn a bit more about me is through my LinkedIn account. My name is Fritha Langford. I'm relatively easy to find. So please send me a message on LinkedIn. That's fine by me. I can't promise that I'll answer straight away, but hopefully you can find a lot about my research and links to my working group at Newcastle. The research that we do in Newcastle is through our animal science team. And again, that's relatively easy. I can give you links to that as well through this podcast. If you're interested in animal welfare and you're interested in learning more about animal welfare, whatever your education stage at the moment, one of the courses that I would recommend that I was involved in making, I have to admit that, but it is free of charge, is one through Coursera. It's called Animal Behavior and Welfare. And it is I think it's over 4 weeks. It's a little while ago since we made it, but it means that you can go through some of these issues at your own time, see some videos about all of the different animal sectors and how we think about animal welfare from a scientific standpoint. I think that would be really useful to go and have a look at. In terms of yeah, so yeah, in terms of collaboration and interest in what I'm doing personally, LinkedIn, in terms of what we're doing generally at Newcastle's animal science pages, in terms of learning new courses, then Coursera. And there are now increasing university level courses around the world in animal welfare. So if that's something interesting to you, then I would really sincerely hope that people would take that up. It's a fascinating area of study. And if you're interested in animals and you're interested in how they interact with humans and then the sustainability questions and all of that, then going on to further study is a really good idea. Obviously, I know that not everybody can do that, so hopefully those people can look up the Coursera information and look at that instead as a shorter period. But yeah, that's where I would go to find out a little bit more information about me and the things that I teach.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I have loved your Coursera courses, and
Good.
they you provide really helpful frameworks to think about in any of these spaces, and certainly for those caring for companion animals. So they help to provide a bit more depth at some of the topics that we've touched upon in each of these
Absolutely.
spaces.
There's one, in fact, called The Truth of Cats and Dogs. And that one really goes into the behavioral issues that we sometimes see with our pets in the home environment as well. So that one's a really useful one for those people who want to know more about animal welfare, but specifically in the companion animal area.
Thank you so much. Is there anything we haven't yet touched upon or that you'd like
Oh,
to share as
tons,
closing
tons.
thoughts?
It it's a never-ending subject. There's so much to learn. There's so much we don't know. There's so much that we can go into further. It's a fascinating subject to be within. I've always found that people who work, be they in research or non-governmental organizations or within industry, are really forward-thinking, but also lovely people. I recommend that if you are really keen in wanting to get into this area, that you do try and push that a little bit forward. We're open to having more people. Keep an open mind though, because having an open mind allows you to think critically about the sources in which you're getting information from and consider where the evidence lies. And that's quite an important part when there's so much conflicting information, particularly if we could just go online.
And if I can, without taking us into more of a depth than we have time for at the moment, I think this is a really important point that we've touched on a couple times, where
Mm,
if we give this specific example of there is not evidence
mm,
to support cats going on a plant-based diet, meaning even if you have read accounts of people attempting something on their own, that the science suggests it's not healthy for a cat
mhm,
to be on a plant-based diet, at least at this stage. Where would be the kind of place you would recommend as a pet parent or a member of a research or industry team to go to be able to get a better sense of the science and to be able to navigate the point you just mentioned in terms of really understanding where is the information coming from and how to sort out a multitude of information that's going to be available on any given search term.
mhm. If that person was a researcher and has access to high quality research online, then obviously that's the place that they need to go. However, the huge majority of people either don't have access or perhaps find those a little bit daunting, those types of papers, because they're obviously written by scientists for other scientists rather than the public domain. So, information in the public domain from trusted sources. So, we might, for example, go to our veterinary associations. So, the AVMA or the BVA in the US and the UK would be two places that I think provide good, high quality information that pet parents can go and look up. Other organisations, other trusted organisations would be those who focus on animal welfare. So, for example, the RSPCA here in the UK or Compassion in World Farming, if you're interested in farming topics, are non-governmental organisations that use evidence within their work. So those would be the places that I would start from. Obviously, there's so much information out there online, but people who are connected with university backgrounds with either animal science or veterinary medicine would be places that I think would be more trusted individuals than perhaps some of the people that we see. Of course, there's all sorts of things out there, and there's loads of different ways of keeping animals that could be equally good. But in terms of the evidence, particularly when we're thinking about something which is a little bit contentious, such as the plant based diet for cats, I think we need to base what we know on, yeah, the high quality information that veterinarians would be able to provide you with.
Yes,
If you're really worried about something to do with your pet, I recommend a veterinarian as the first port of call.
absolutely. Yeah, so a reminder whenever there's a key question, including before you change your pet's food,
Yes,
talk to your veterinarian.
absolutely.
Yes. You're an underutilized resource when we think about these types of decisions, as
Hmm.
we know from the evidence, right? And
Yeah.
a wealth of information to be able to help navigate all those different choices and the key considerations for your individual pet.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Thank you so much I'm so grateful for this conversation. It's been fascinating and tremendously insightful. And I would love to continue the conversation. I know we are out of time,
We,
but
we
yes, hope
definitely
we
are.
can in
Thank
the
you so
future.
much for summarizing so brilliantly. You were able to take my ramblings and make them into sense, which I think is a wonderful talent. So thank you, Erin. It's been lovely to talk to you today.
Thank you so much. So enjoyed the conversation. We will make sure that these links are available both through the recording as well as comments, since I know we have quite a few things to include. and I certainly recommend checking out Fritha's courses, her research, and work. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining this episode of the Compassionate and Beneficial Living podcast. Please follow, subscribe, share your comments, share with others, and let us know what topics you'd like to hear covered next.